So, this one will, no, I don't think it's going to remain a private video. So, for this one, I want to talk about scheduling conflicts, the death of campaigns, and what you can do to mitigate them, ways you can kind of roll with the punches and adapt and change what the campaign is, because sometimes that's the only option. And I'm going to start the rambling with an anecdote, because that's like 65% of what I am, anecdotes. So, during the week, I'm in a Curse of Strahd game. For a while, we played on Tuesday nights, and it had 4 players. Then, one of the players' schedule changed, and he was no longer available on Tuesday nights. So he switched, or to allow him to continue to play, we switched to Monday nights. Because most of us, we all had no issue switching to a different night of the week. Then, I think about 2 or 3 weeks later, or at least 2 or 3 sessions later, we ended up, another player dropped out of the campaign. And this was also a player that was playing 2 characters at once, a druid and a wizard, and the druid was mostly just there for heals and really didn't do a whole lot else. And also it kind of barely had a personality, or they did, but they didn't engage a whole lot. That was left to the other characters. So by picking up a wizard, by playing a wizard at the same time, they could play a character that actually had some influence and some interaction with the game world. But as a result of this player dropping, we effectively lost 2 characters instead of 1. Okay, that's an issue. So we started to strategize and figure out how we can deal with this. Do we want to keep the 3 players in the campaign and just continue that way, restructure everything and have the other characters drop out? Do we want to bring another player in, which can take a while? Do we want to, and what the solution we ended up on was, at least for this mission so far, we were just going to run that druid and wizard ourselves just to have extra party members. And then we were probably going to keep the druid, and me and another player were going to alternate running the character, because it's a very easy character to run. And then either the third character, the cleric player, would either also bring in a wizard type of character that they could also play, because they're a very experienced role player, and they would have a much easier time playing 2 characters at once, especially because the cleric they were playing was fairly socially distant. But we ended up not getting that far, because we had a full month of delays of canceled sessions for one reason or another. I think if I can remember, the first one was I think 2 players had to cancel, or the DM had to suddenly do something. Then the second week, they had a sudden emergency, a friend was in. They didn't tell us what was going on. They're just like, hey, something's happening and I can't talk about it. All right, go do you. Then the third week, it was the DM was struggling because of the player composition, and then we started to figure out what it was, or what it was going to be moving forward. And then the fourth week, the DM got laryngitis after everything was settled. All right. And then the fifth week, which was yesterday, since we played, the DM ended up having a complete schedule change at work, and now they work Monday and Tuesday nights. So, the campaign is completely being restructured, and we mostly have two options. Well, one, the cleric player is just dropping out. They can't do it. They can only play Monday night. So it's down to me and another player that I play with all the time in several other games. They brought me into this Curse of Strahd game because they had other players dropping out. So, here's the options. First, move to Thursday nights and try to bring in some more players, because while having 3 players manage like 1.5 PCs essentially is fine, but doing it with 2 players, not as good. So that's the option. Move to Thursday nights and try to bring in some more players, which may take a while. We don't even know if we're going to be able to play by like next week. Maybe some miracle will happen and we'll have players by tonight, which it's Tuesday now, and then the game can start Thursday. Who knows? But the other option is to have our 2 characters, Senlir and Etsley, a barbarian and a hexblade warlock, rolled into this DM's other Curse of Strahd game. It's like, it's the same game. He's doing all the same homebrew stuff. So we could have our characters join that. And that game already has 4 players. There's technically a 5th, but they're probably dropping out and not worried about that. But the issue there is we move from a fairly small group of what has for a while been 3 players, or 3.5, depending on how you look at it. And we move to a group with 6 players. Now, that can be tricky, because each player gets less spotlight, and that's something to argue. That's some nuance to discuss. And I don't doubt this DM's ability to run for a large group and make sure everyone gets an even spotlight. But it's like, is that the vibe we want to go for? Like a larger group with less emphasis on each individual character? And we mostly voted for the move to Thursday and find new players option, with the caveat that if we can't find new players, we'll revisit rolling into the Wednesday group. But so to conclude that story, we've had tons of scheduling conflicts, tons of delays, and a campaign that is near death because of these things. And so, how are some ways to prevent these? Well, one, if the DM is sick or has conflicts, you can't do anything about that, and that cancels the game. That's just how it is. But if a single player can't make it, run the game anyway. Just run the game anyway. It does not matter if one player misses it. Because, well, sure, that player misses out on stuff. But the rest of the players, they all made time for this. They cleared their schedules. They moved things around. Or maybe, maybe they didn't have to clear anything and they just have free time. That's still free time that they're dedicating to the game. And by canceling it, if one player can't make it, I find that disrespectful of everyone else's time. I'm more than willing to attempt to run, if I'm the DM, I'm more than willing to allow the player that has a conflict to, say, maybe we could do a small one-on-one at some other point to catch them up. Maybe they could sort of participate halfway via text. Done that, I think twice now, where they kind of text in what they want to do, and I run the character kind of in the meantime. But overall, that's the main point. If one player drops, or if one player can't make that session, you run it anyway. If you have half the players missing, which depends on the size of your group, if you have a 4-person group and 2 players can't make it, well, that's a bigger issue now. But if you have a 5-player group and 2 players can't make it, I'd probably still run. I'd still go anyway, probably. It depends what the players want to do, how they, you ask them. But if you have more than 50% of the players able to show up, you run the game. Because I think it's disrespectful otherwise. Especially, I don't know how many times I've cleared my schedule and I move stuff around, and I have discussions with my wife. We move events around. She wants to do things. I have to make time for her, but I want to play D&D, so I make time for that. And we move scheduling around. And then the game gets canceled because one or two players can't make it, whether it's for totally legitimate reasons, like, hey, I got in a car accident, or hey, I have to go to the hospital, or whatever it is, or like other reasons, like, hey, I forgot I had homework due, or hey, my long lost brother showed up and he wants to go to dinner tonight, so I'm doing that instead. Fuck you guys. Like, whatever it is. And not that any of those reasons are less valid, but there's always that element of you have to respect other people's time. So ultimately, you have to be willing to run the game with people missing, and that's just how it is. Other ways to prevent this is, by avoiding just canceling the game flat out. I think goes a long way towards keeping people invested, because I know that I get a certain momentum with a game. Like, if I'm playing every week or regularly, like if it's every other week, after I play 2 sessions consecutively, then I really start to get into the character and it becomes much easier for me. But when then there's a cancellation and I reset back to 0 and I gotta get back into it again. So keeping that momentum also keeps everybody in it and willing to play, and everybody keeps going. That's a big thing, I think. And also, you have to be willing to modify the structure of a campaign depending on what's going on. For the Erlenmeyer group, I think we had 8 players at the beginning, which we did for the prologue opening section of the campaign. And then the DM and the players realized they can't handle this many players. And I don't blame them. That's too many fucking players. But, so we came to a compromise where we would split the party into 2 groups, and they would play, and they were on a bi-weekly schedule. We'd play every other week. And then, more or less, this actually led effectively to some DM burnout on the DM's part, because they were running a game every week, and they were effectively running 2 different campaigns, more or less, every other week, on top of, doing other things. And the DM isn't the most organized or best, I guess, the type of person with, a good mindset and, good scheduling habits for this type of thing. So it really affected them. And then players dropped out, as they do, and we ended up having a total of 5 players at that point. So the decision was made to roll one group into the other, because we had at that point we had 2 parties of 3. And that was all right, you could make our argument for rolling that, and playing with 6 would be okay. But then one of the players dropped out, made the decision to roll them into the other group, and on top of that, we ended up kicking another player out, because that player had a variety of other issues. Likewise, complete disrespect of other people's time. I'll talk about that in a minute, but then we ended up rolling that player the 2 players into the other group. We kicked one out. And then we had 4 players. We brought in a long-term guest. And then there were some issues there later on, but it's whatever. And then, so we had 1 group, but we stuck to the bi-weekly schedule because it was much easier for the DM. Because ultimately, the DM has to have fun too. And if it feels too much like work, then you shouldn't have that campaign. But, so you have to be willing to modify campaign structures, which is what we're doing in this Curse of Strahd game. But then sometimes you do have to kick players out, because this player in particular, 1, she disrespected people's time constantly. We would always post the schedule. It was actually kind of a running joke that we had a scheduling channel in our Discord, and I would, as the most, organized player, I would post in there, hey, next session, this day, this time, be there or be somewhere else. And I would post it, at the end of this session or within a few days, when the next session is. And then, the day before, this player would show up in the group chat, not the Discord, and ask, hey, when is session? And either, I think the first couple of times I just mentioned, hey, it's this time, this day. And it's usually the same time, Sundays at 3 or whatever. And I was okay. And then the 4th or 5th time she would ask, I just started to respond with, check the Discord. It's in the Discord. And then after a few times, I think the DM took a screenshot of me responding with check the Discord, and then took a screenshot of them posting the last screenshot, and it started an infinite recursive loop downward into me saying check the Discord. Then also the player was more than willing to roleplay, but they really kind of took over the space in really, I don't want to use the term aggressive, but they just kind of overly dominated every chance they got. There'd be a small sequence where they're talking to a doctor or something. They're talking to another character. And their character really doesn't have a huge amount of reason to be the face of this conversation, the focal point. But she's constantly interjecting, asking long-winded questions that have very little to do with the situation at hand. And on top of that, here's another great example. During a Halloween, it was a Christmas one-shot, where we had our characters in a dream sequence. Their character was a sea elf, and we encountered an underwater cavern, and it was the only direction to go in this cavern we were walking in the rest of the time. So we get to this cavern, and there's a sea elf. Okay, can you go in the water and then check how far this goes? And as soon as you find an air, somewhere where it opens up, come back and get us. Okay, cool. And then the character went in the water, found where it opens up, and then continued to just walk around and never came back for us. And, this wasn't a separate whisper, so we were oh, what's going on? We heard the player doing this. And the player is just kind of going off on their own and basically not allowing us to play because we have to sit. We told her to come back as soon as they find it, but we have no way to communicate. So as far as we know, she just hasn't found it yet. Meanwhile, she's wandering around in this dangerous cavern as a wizard that doesn't know how to play her fucking class. So she ends up wandering around, and then after 5 minutes in game, we're fuck it, and we just go in after her. And we find it's a very short underwater cavern. It takes a minute to swim through it. We get on the other side, we track her around, and we find her stuck to a fucking mimic. And then we fight the Mimic and 2 other monsters. We end that fight, and then my character, the survivalist lizard folk, basically just yells at her, like, "Are you trying to become food? What's wrong with you? You have a group that can protect you. Are you too stupid to, like, rely on your group?" So that was a whole series of mounting issues. This is the type of player that would drag on the game, and sometimes you have to kick players like that out. So, yeah, I guess, at the end of the day, you have to change campaigns up. And going back to that Curse of Strahd game, the options we have, moving to Thursday, finding a new player, rolling into the other group, there's pros and cons. Finding a new player, we don't know if the new players are going to be any good, if they're going to jive with us, all that jazz. But we will continue the continuity of our instance of Curse of Strahd. All of the specific kind of choices we've made up to this point will be intact. Whereas if we roll into the other group, that's not as much the case. The DM has said that they have like a contingency for that, and they're planning around that. But how much can you plan for that? How many conflicting choices can you make, or how many conflicting events can coexist? It's a very strange concept, and even if it's done perfectly, it's still kind of strange. And on top of that, you're going to get a different vibe. It's our 2 characters coming in to a group that's already fairly established. So there's pros and cons, and I like both ideas, quite honestly, because the other party sounds interesting. And there's no I'm playing a barbarian, my other friend is playing a hexblade, and the other party that would be joining is a Bladesinger wizard, a moon druid, an artificer, and a rogue monk multi-class. There's not a huge amount of overlap there. Especially they're just looking at their party directly. The moon druid is obviously their tank and healer. That's kind of an issue. Because if the moon druid is in animal form tanking and they go down or somebody else goes down, well, if they're in animal form healing, they can't, or in animal form tanking, they can't heal and get somebody up or heal a lot of damage or whatever. They'd have to drop animal form to do it. Maybe the artificer has some healing, but then they that's the thing. They don't have a dedicated tank and they don't have a dedicated healer. Not that you need a tank in 5e, but having a single dude that can soak up a lot of damage is good. Having a really surviving, a really beefy character on the board is really useful to have, because they will absorb some damage somewhere that might otherwise go towards the squishier players, even if that tank doesn't have any form of control, which my barbarian does. They have the slasher feat and the sentinel feat, both movement reduction abilities and ways to get extra attacks as reactions, things like that, to whenever a monster attacks somebody else in range, things like that. They also lack a face, because unless they rolled really, really high on their stats, nobody's really in that party's really going to have high charisma, unless they hey, nobody in the group has high charisma, so I'm going to have lower con or something so I can have higher charisma, so I can do some persuading. Nobody has that, which is a role the Hexblade would fulfill very well. And likewise, there is some character overlap between the Bladesinger and the Hexblade, but in a lot of ways, the Hexblade is going to do that like kind of gish job much better. Because the way I look at it, a Hexblade is a martial with some spell casting. And a Blade Singer is just a wizard that can get into melee sometimes. That has options to get into melee. That's mostly how I see it working. Because a Blade Singer wizard, they don't have a very large hit die. They have to rely on Blade Song to get really high AC. And that's great that they can have like incredibly high AC. But they're also a fairly multi-ability score dependent class because they're going to need intelligence for their spells and for Blade Song. They're going to need Constitution for survivability, which everybody does. They're going to need Dex for their weapon attacks and for AC. So it's always really difficult for a Blade Singer to be like really, really powerful, have like really high bonuses to hit and damage and have high spellcasting modifiers and have good health. They're just not going to have a lot of that. So, whereas a Hexblade, they just need charisma and then like enough con and enough dex. Especially because they're going to be wearing medium armor. They're going to be and then their dex, their AC is fine. Like, that's mostly it. That's how, like, Blade Singers just have or Hexblades just have an easier time. So, and also our Hexblade got a hold of Illusionist Bracers, so there's that. Both our Hexblade and my Barbarian do shit tons of damage in melee, which I don't know if that other group does. So, there'd be enough differences in what our characters would bring to the table party comp wise. And then as far as how the characters would intermesh, I don't know. I haven't met these other characters. But like I said, either option is good with me. I can see the value in both, but we're trying to find new players first to avoid the death of a campaign. And I guess that's all I have on this subject. It's a pretty long one.